All 1942, Eastern India, a winter dawn that felt older than the war itself. The POW camp stirred before the sun did. Frost clung to the bamboo fences, turning every strand of barbed wire into a shimmering thread of silver. A whistle split the morning stillness. Japanese prisoners stepped out of their barracks, breath rising in pale clouds as they lined up for roll call. Behind them, the kitchen fires cracked awake, sending columns of steam spiraling into the cold sky. The scent of boiling tea, strong, earthy, unmistakably Indian, drifted across the yard, softening what was otherwise a harsh military ritual. Up in the guard tower, the silhouette of an Indian soldier adjusted his rifle, but his gaze was calm, almost contemplative. The war had carved oceans between these men, yet here they stood, enemy and enemy, breathing the same chilled air. One Japanese prisoner shivered violently, clutching his thin coat. Another beside him whispered, "Will we survive this winter?" And then, from the kitchen steps, an Indian sepoy called out, "Tea is ready." It was such a simple sentence, yet it would become a memory engraved forever in the diaries of men who never expected kindness. By mid-1942, the tide of war in Southeast Asia had swept thousands of soldiers into captivity. Among them were Japanese troops captured in Burma and along the Indo-Malayan front, men who had been trained to believe that surrender was worse than death, that captivity stripped a soldier of honor, that returning home alive after falling into enemy hands was an unbearable shame. Yet war, indifferent to ideology, pushed them toward fates no training manual had prepared them for. India, under British command, became an unexpected crossroads of empires. Its vast rail networks, established cantonments, and relatively secure interior regions were ideal for housing prisoners of war. The British Indian Army, one of the largest volunteer forces in the world, was tasked with overseeing these camps, stretching from the plains of Bengal to the forested edges of Assam. And so, Japanese POWs found themselves transported hundreds of miles away from the battlefields where they had fought, wounded, and been taken captive. The camps were not monolithic. Some were improvised from old colonial barracks, while others were hastily constructed with bamboo huts, tin roofing, and fencing reinforced with barbed wire. The guards were Indian soldiers, Punjabis, Gurkhas, Pathans, Tamils, men who themselves came from a mosaic of languages and cultures. Orders flowed from British officers, but much of the daily interaction occurred between captured Japanese soldiers and Indian sepoys who had never before met someone from Japan, much less someone they were told was an enemy of the empire. The conditions varied with geography and season. Monsoon rains could drown a parade ground in hours. Winters in eastern India, while mild compared to the Himalayas, cut sharply, especially for men arriving from tropical battlefields with minimal clothing. The Japanese arrived with torn uniforms, jungle rot, and bodies thinned by weeks of fighting and starvation rations. Indian guards watched them with a mix of caution and curiosity. These were men described in British briefings as fierce fighters, fanatics even. But what arrived instead were tired, mud-stained survivors who looked very human. The governments involved added layers of complexity. Britain managed the overarching POW policy, ensuring compliance with the Geneva Convention. India, still under colonial rule, provided manpower, logistics, and infrastructure. Japan, though condemning surrender, sent occasional inquiries through neutral intermediaries, though many POWs believed they had been erased from official memory. The Indian soldiers guarding them were caught in a peculiar space, colonial subjects enforcing imperial regulations, while dealing with prisoners who believed that dying in battle was a sacred duty. But the cultural differences were perhaps the most striking element of this story. Many Japanese POWs expected brutality. Their own military culture had taught them that enemies treated prisoners with cruelty. After all, that was often what their own army practiced. Instead, they encountered something else entirely. Structured discipline, yes, but also a strange, disarming gentleness woven into everyday routines. Indian soldiers prayed before sunrise, shared jokes in languages the POWs did not understand, and sometimes hummed old folk songs while patrolling the fences at dusk. The journey to India lingered in the memories of many Japanese prisoners. After capture, they were marched to staging camps in Burma, then placed on rail transports. The rhythmic clatter of train wheels became the pulse of uncertainty as landscapes shifted. dense jungles giving way to open plains, villages flashing by, children running alongside the tracks with wide, unafraid eyes. For many Japanese soldiers, it was their first encounter with India, its vastness, its poverty, its overwhelming diversity. The train rides were long and exhausting. Rations were minimal, but not deliberately cruel. Guards distributed chapatis, lentils, or rice whenever possible. Some POWs were surprised to find that Indian sepoys offered water from their own containers, even sharing pieces of jaggery or fruit during halts. Such gestures, small but sincere, challenged everything these men had been told about enemy behavior. When the prisoners finally arrived at the camp, the one whose dawn rituals we witnessed, they did so in a mixture of fear, resignation, and bewilderment. Barbed wire surrounded them, yes, but the atmosphere lacked the brutality they had anticipated. Indian soldiers stood with rifles slung, but eyes calm. Smoke from kitchen fires drifted lazily into the sky. A British officer read out the rules: work duties, medical checks, disciplinary measures, and rights under the Geneva Convention. And then came the phrase, that many Japanese POWs wrote about later in their diaries: "You will be treated as soldiers, not animals." To men who had been prepared to die rather than surrender, those words felt unreal. Some refused to believe them. Others looked around at the terrain, the barracks, the guards, trying to understand a world where the enemy offered tea instead of torment. It was in this complex, contradictory landscape, shaped by imperial orders, human instincts, cultural misunderstandings, and unexpected empathy, that the story of shared tea would eventually unfold. For the Japanese POWs, the first weeks inside the Indian camp were a study in contrasts, moments of tension punctuated by gestures of kindness, rigid military order blending unexpectedly with the warmth of human routine. The camp was divided into zones: barracks, a kitchen yard, a small infirmary, a work shed, and outer perimeters where guard towers marked the boundaries. Each section carried its own rhythm, its own small world of interactions. The day began with the dawn roll call, a ritual inherited from British military discipline. For Japanese prisoners accustomed to their own strict drills, the process felt familiar yet strange. The commands barked in English, translated by an interpreter, echoed across the cold morning air. Indian sepoys stood watch nearby, their woolen shawls wrapped tightly around their uniforms, rifles slung against their shoulders. Some of them observed the Japanese with a soldier's quiet respect, recognizing exhaustion, discipline, and pride even in captivity. Food became the first cultural battleground. Indian kitchens were filled with aromas utterly foreign to Japanese soldiers: turmeric, mustard seeds, boiling lentils, wood smoke-infused rice. Many POWs hesitated, suspecting trickery or punishment disguised as sustenance. Others simply could not tolerate the spices, their bodies already weakened by malnutrition. The guards, unaware of such nuances at first, interpreted the reluctance as defiance. A few scoldings followed, 1 or 2 stern warnings from British officers, and then gradually, a slow adjustment. The cooks softened the flavors, added more rice, reduced chilies. Human beings, after all, learn faster than policy. Cultural misunderstandings were more challenging. Japanese POWs initially avoided eye contact with Indian guards, perceiving it as a breach of humility, or perhaps an invitation to hostility. Indian sepoys, in turn, misread the lowered gazes as arrogance. The Japanese bowing habit confused some guards. The sepoys' casual friendliness confused the Japanese. Even simple greetings carried layers of unfamiliarity. A Sikh guard might nod with a warm smile, beard flowing beneath his turban, only to receive a stiff, formal bow in return. A Hindu sepoy might offer water with his right hand, only to find a Japanese prisoner too startled or too proud to accept. But routine has its own quiet strength. Work assignments created the first bridge. Japanese soldiers were tasked with clearing brush, repairing bamboo fencing, or assisting in kitchen chores. Labor was monitored but not excessively harsh. The sepoys, veterans of frontier patrols and desert campaigns, understood the limits of human endurance. They worked alongside the POWs at times, showing them how to tie knots the Indian way, how to angle a shovel to cut through packed soil, how to carry logs more efficiently. Physical labor dissolved barriers faster than conversation ever could. Medical care also reshaped perceptions. The camp infirmary, run by Indian medics under British supervision, treated wounds and infections with an efficiency that startled many Japanese POWs. They had been told that capture meant torture or neglect. Yet here they were, having their feet bandaged, fevers treated, malaria monitored. One former corporal later wrote in his diary, "The Indian doctor touched my arm gently when checking my pulse. I had forgotten what gentleness felt like." The environment surrounding the camp played a role too. India's vast, unpredictable nature seeped into the daily lives of the prisoners. Monsoon rains turned the ground into a thick churn of mud. Winter mornings brought thin frost that glittered on rooftops. Birds filled the sky at dusk with cries that no Japanese forest had ever echoed. For men stripped of freedom, the land itself became a silent companion, neither enemy nor ally, just immense, unknowable, and constant. Over time, patterns evolved. Some Japanese POWs began learning Hindi words from the sepoys, paani for water, kana for food, than for cold. In return, Indian guards picked up fragments of Japanese phrases, often mispronounced but offered with honest curiosity. A strange, fragile camaraderie took shape. Not friendship, at least not yet, but an easing of fear, a recognition of shared humanity beneath the uniforms and scars. And always, there was tea. The sepoys drank it constantly, at sunrise, during patrol, in the quiet hours before nightfall. The Japanese prisoners watched the ritual, puzzled by the devotion Indians showed to this simple beverage. Tea became a symbol of normalcy within the camp, a sign that life still held small comforts. At first, the POWs weren't invited to share it. Tea was something guards drank, prisoners observed. But the sight remained constant enough to settle into their memories. British officers visited periodically, checking compliance with international regulations. Reports emphasized discipline, health, and labor output. Yet none of those documents captured the quiet transformation taking place, the slow unraveling of hatred, the small cracks forming in the rigid ideology that had taught Japanese soldiers to view all outsiders as lesser beings. Still, tension lingered beneath the surface. Shame weighed heavily on the POWs. Some withdrew into silence. Others clung fiercely to military posture, refusing to show fatigue. The sepoys sensed the emotional burden, but did not fully understand it. To them, surrender was unfortunate, but not dishonorable. For many Japanese soldiers, it was a spiritual wound deeper than any physical injury. And yet, and this is where the story begins to turn, the Indian sepoys, with their easy smiles and steaming cups of chai, slowly became the most unexpected healers of that wound. For it was not a grand gesture, nor an official policy, that changed the relationship between guard and prisoner. It was a simple act, sharing tea on a cold morning, and when it finally happened, the moment would leave many Japanese POWs stunned, speechless, and forever altered in the way they saw the men they once called enemies. For the newly arrived Japanese POWs, food was not merely sustenance. It was identity, routine, memory, the last familiar thread connecting them to the world they had lost. But inside the Indian POW camp, the kitchen fires produced aromas so foreign that many soldiers felt assaulted before they ever tasted a bite. Breakfast was usually rice or flatbread, accompanied by lentils simmered with turmeric and cumin. To Indian soldiers, that golden, fragrant steam meant comfort. To Japanese POWs, whose palates were shaped by miso, soy, barley tea, and the delicate balance of home cooking, the unfamiliar spices created confusion and sometimes fear. The prisoners whispered among themselves, was this safe? Was it meant to weaken them? Why did it burn the tongue? The first days saw many trays returned half-eaten. Some men tried to scrape spices aside. Others gulped water until their stomachs cramped. A few even apologized to the guards for their inability to eat, deeply ashamed of refusing food when their bodies clearly needed it. But the Indian sepoys noticed. One evening, a sepoy named Havildar Singh watched a group of Japanese men struggle with dal that was far too spicy for them. He returned to the kitchen and quietly suggested changes. The next day, the cooks reduced the chilies and added more plain rice. Later, on weekends, they quietly boiled potatoes without spices for the most sensitive prisoners. It was a small gesture, unrecorded in official reports, but remembered vividly in personal diaries. Many Japanese POWs later wrote that this moment, the moment the guards altered their own cooking to ease the suffering of their captives, was the first crack in the wall that war had built between them. They still felt shame, but now shame stood beside gratitude. And gratitude, even in the smallest dose, is powerful enough to change a man. If food was the first shock, clothing, and the lack of it, was the second. The Japanese POWs had arrived in India wearing the remnants of tropical uniforms, thin khaki cotton, frayed caps, sandals worn down to almost nothing. Many had marched in mud for weeks before capture. Some carried jungle rot on their feet. Others shivered through nights with only a single torn blanket to shield them. Winter in eastern India was mild to locals but punishing to men coming from humid battlefields. During the first dawn roll call, Indian sepoys watched the prisoners tremble in the cold, arms folded tightly, breath fogging the air. The British quartermaster's stores were slow to issue replacements, and for several days, the POWs endured the chill with little more than determination. But Indian soldiers, shaped by a culture where offering warmth is a moral instinct, stepped in. A sepoy named Abdul Hamid noticed a Japanese private whose hands had turned blue from the cold. Without ceremony, he removed his own spare woolen gloves and pressed them into the prisoner's hands. "Tand lag ti hai?" he asked gently. "Are you cold?" The prisoner, startled and unable to speak, simply bowed again and again. Others followed in quiet solidarity. Old shawls, worn turbans repurposed into scarves, extra socks, items that sepoys' families had sent from home, found their way into the possession of the Japanese prisoners. None of these acts were officially sanctioned. None were written into camp records, but they spread through the barracks like warmth itself. In return, the prisoners began cleaning their huts more diligently, polishing tools and repairing fences with extra care. Not out of fear, out of respect. For the first time since their capture, they felt seen, not as enemies, not as disgraced soldiers, but as human beings enduring the same cold morning wind. It began on a morning so cold that even the camp dogs refused to leave the ashes of the night fire. Frost clung to the metal buckets outside the kitchen. A milky fog hung low across the compound, blurring the guard tower into a ghostly silhouette. Japanese POWs lined up for roll call, coats thin, breath trembling in the air. They stood in stiff silence, enduring, waiting, surviving. The Indian sepoys were little better off, shawls wrapped tight, hands cupped over steaming tin mugs of chai as they tried to warm their fingers. Tea was their ritual, their shield against the cold, their anchor in a world torn apart by war. The prisoners watched them, curious but wary. Though weeks had passed since their arrival, interactions had remained polite but distant. Respect existed, yes, but connection had not yet formed. The shift came quietly. On this particular morning, while the prisoners stood shivering, Subedar Kishan Lal emerged from the kitchen yard carrying a large brass kettle. Its surface glowed in the pale dawn light. Steam curled from its spout in soft, fragrant ribbons. Chai, rich, sweet, spiced lightly with ginger, filled the air. A murmur rippled through the Japanese ranks. The Subedar stopped mid-yard. His orders were simple. Take the kettle to the guard post. Serve tea to his men. Nothing more. Yet, as he looked at the prisoners, faces pale from the cold, hands trembling, a few coughing weakly, something shifted inside him. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps compassion, perhaps the memory of his own brother serving, somewhere in Burma, equally far from home. He lifted his chin toward the nearest sepoy. "Bring extra cups." The sepoy hesitated. "Sir, for them?" "For them." That small decision traveled through the air like a spark leaping from one dry branch to another. Minutes later, the Subedar walked toward the prisoners, kettle in hand. Indian soldiers followed, carrying stacks of metal cups. The Japanese POWs straightened instinctively, unsure if this was a test, a reprimand, or simply another unfamiliar ritual of captivity. But then the Subedar spoke, not in English, not in Hindi. He used the few Japanese words he had learned. "Cha, nomimasu ka? Would you like to drink tea?" The men blinked, stunned. Some thought they had misheard. Others stared at the cups as though they were weapons made of kindness. One prisoner, a young private named Sato, took a step forward. He had frostbite on his fingers, bandaged only days earlier. Slowly, cautiously, he extended his hands. The subadar poured chai into his cup. Steam rose between them like a veil lifting. Sato bowed deeply. Not the formal military bow, but the slow, trembling bow of someone overwhelmed. He whispered, barely audible, "Arigato." His voice cracked on the second syllable. That moment broke something open. Other prisoners stepped forward. Some tried to hide their emotions, their shame, their gratitude. Others couldn't. Tears welled in more than a few eyes, not because tea was being offered, but because dignity was being returned. For Japanese soldiers taught that an enemy showed no mercy. This simple act unraveled years of indoctrination. One POW later wrote in his diary, "In that cup of tea, I tasted the warmth of a world I thought I had lost forever." But it wasn't only the prisoners who were changed. The Indian sepoys watched the gratitude, the trembling bows, the silent tears forming on faces hardened by war, and something softened in them too. Until now, they had seen the POWs through layers of orders and duty. Now they saw them as men, cold, scared, far from home, struggling under burdens invisible to the eye. To seal the moment, a Japanese sergeant stepped forward, his posture stiff, his expression strained. He bowed deeply before speaking. "We did not expect kindness from those we fought, yet you offer warmth. We do not know how to repay this." Subadar Kishan Lal responded with a simple truth. War is between governments. Tea is between people. Laughter, soft, astonished, broke somewhere in the back of the Japanese line. Even some sepoys chuckled under their breath. A few POWs sipped the tea too quickly and burned their tongues, leading to sheepish smiles and embarrassed wiping of eyes. For a single morning, the walls between guard and prisoner dissolved, not through politics, not through treaties, but through a cup of hot chai shared under a gray winter sky. The days following the shared tea unfolded with a quiet, unforgettable transformation. It did not happen through grand announcements or official orders. It happened in the almost invisible spaces between duty and humanity. Small glances, hesitant gestures, murmured words from men who had spent their whole lives believing that enemies existed outside the reach of compassion. The morning after the tea sharing, a group of Japanese POWs gathered near the low fence by the kitchen yard. They stood in an orderly line, not out of obligation, but out of a need they could not yet name. They waited patiently, almost ceremonially, until an Indian guard noticed them. Naik Raghavan approached, rifle slung over one shoulder, eyebrows raised in question. The Japanese men nudged their spokesman forward, a thin, soft-spoken sergeant named Mori. He bowed deeply, the breath of his bow forming a pale cloud in the winter air. When he finally spoke, his English was halting, broken, but filled with a sincerity that made the guard blink in surprise. "Yesterday, the tea, we remember. Japanese soldier will not forget kindness." His voice trembled slightly, as if unused to expressing gratitude to those he had once been trained to kill. Raghavan nodded awkwardly, not knowing how to respond, but Mori continued, searching for words like a man trying to light a fire in unfamiliar wind. "In our army, surrender is shame. Some of us feel we are already ghosts. But you," he paused, struggling, "you give us back a small piece of being human." The guard felt as though the cold wind had paused with him. He had expected bowed heads, discipline, even fear, but not this kind of honesty, this raw confession wrapped in quiet dignity. Over the next several days, more prisoners stepped forward, drawn toward the guards by an invisible thread woven from the simple warmth of the shared tea. Their words were hesitant at first, spoken through interpreters or clumsy English, yet each one carried the weight of a lifetime of indoctrination slowly cracking open. One older corporal, his shoulders stooped by hunger and months of struggle, spoke in a whisper as he warmed his hands over the kitchen fire. "We were told the enemy treats prisoners like animals," he said. "We trained to die before capture. But your tea, it was not trick. It was mercy." He stared at the flames for a long moment. "No one told us mercy could exist in war. Nearby, a Gurkha guard sharpening his kukri paused long enough to reply, "Kindness does not weaken a soldier." He tapped the blade lightly. "Cruelty does." The corporal had no answer, only a bow of deep, conflicted gratitude. Some confessions went deeper, carrying years of emotional weight. A young private, barely more than a boy, admitted through tears that he feared returning home alive. "To return after surrender, family will think I am shame. Better to die in battle than live in disgrace." Yet his voice cracked as he added, "But your tea made me think life after shame is possible." The sepoys stood silent, absorbing the words. Honor, shame, expectation. These were burdens Indian soldiers understood too well. The distance between the two sides shrank further, not through language, but through shared human ache. One evening, as sepoys brewed another kettle of chai, a Japanese sergeant approached shyly. The steam drifted toward him, warm and fragrant. He inhaled, eyes softening. "The smell," he murmured, "it reminds us of roasted barley tea at home. Different, but warmth is same. That is why many of us cried." He bowed to the kettle itself, as if honoring a memory resurrected by scent. The most unexpected words came from a senior non-commissioned officer, a man who had carried himself with fierce discipline since the day he arrived. He approached Subedar Kishan Lal near the parade ground, bowed stiffly, and declared in steady, solemn English, "When we return home, if we return home, we will tell families that Indian soldiers treated us not as enemies, but as men. We will say India fought with honor." Kishan Lal, moved but composed, answered quietly, "If you return home, remember this. Humanity is larger than war." The NCO bowed again, and for the first time, his posture softened. Slowly, the camp began to change. Japanese POWs swept the grounds with more care, repaired tools without being asked, organized their barracks with renewed discipline, not from fear, but from respect. Indian sepoys, in turn, shared jokes, taught simple Hindi phrases, and listened with curious patience as the prisoners hummed melodies from distant Japanese villages. Sometimes, in the cold evenings, two unfamiliar songs, one Japanese, one Indian, rose into the air together, tentative at first, then strangely harmonious. Morning roll call remained strict. Barbed wire still circled the camp. The war outside continued its relentless march. But inside this small corner of India, the boundaries between captor and captive softened, rearranged themselves, became something neither side had expected. A glimpse of what men might be when war's shadow loosens its grip. And through it all, chai remained the quiet center of everything, a cup held between hands that once might have struck each other, a warmth shared across language and allegiance. A simple drink, yes, but also a rebellion against the cruelty of the world. In the diaries that many Japanese POWs kept secretly or reconstructed after repatriation, one line, written in different words by different hands, appeared again and again. "We were defeated by war, but we were healed by the tea shared by Indian soldiers." When the war's tide finally began to shift in 1945, the Japanese POWs sensed it not from official announcements, but from the subtle changes in the camp's atmosphere. Guards received letters more frequently. British officers walked with heavier folders. Radios whispered rumors through static. Conversations between sepoys grew quieter, more serious. And though the prisoners had no access to news, they saw truth reflected in the eyes of their captors. The end was coming. Repatriation became the new, uncertain horizon. For some POWs, the thought of returning home filled their hearts with desperate relief. For others, it filled them with dread. The shame of surrender had not disappeared simply because they had been treated humanely. Many feared facing families who might see them as dishonored, leaders who might reject them, a nation that might prefer to forget them. But as the administrative wheels slowly turned, something else was happening within the camp. Japanese POWs began to prepare for departure in their own quiet ways. Some cleaned their barracks meticulously, leaving them almost spotless, an unspoken gesture of gratitude. Others crafted small carvings from leftover wood, simple figures and miniature tools, and gifted them to sepoys they had grown close to. A few wrote letters they would never send, addressed to families they had not seen in years, trying to explain what captivity had taught them. Not humiliation, but unexpected humanity. Indian soldiers, too, felt the change. They had never expected to form bonds with men they had once fought. Yet, as the departure drew near, the camp felt heavier, quieter, as if something delicate was about to be dismantled. Some sepoys brought small parting gifts, pieces of fruit, worn scarves, extra biscuits from their rations. These gestures were exchanged almost shyly, like tokens passed between friends unsure of whether they were allowed to admit friendship. One morning, a column of Japanese POWs prepared to board the trucks that would take them to the port. Their uniforms were cleaner, their posture straighter, their faces a mixture of hope and sorrow. As they lined up, an unexpected hush settled over the camp. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the silence. A young Japanese private stepped out of line and bowed deeply toward the Indian sepoys. His voice trembled as he said, "You gave us warmth when our own nation forgot us." Another added, "We return home alive because of you." Their words spread quickly through the ranks, each man offering his own version of farewell, some in Japanese, some in broken English, some in gestures alone. Then something remarkable happened. A senior Japanese sergeant, who had rarely spoken throughout his captivity, turned to Subedar Kishan Lal. He reached into his pocket and offered a small notebook, his diary, the one place he had recorded his truths. He could not take it back to Japan. It would be taken from him during processing. So he pressed it into the Subedar's hands as a final act of trust. "Please," the sergeant said softly, "remember that we were human, even in our lowest moment." Kishan Lal, moved beyond words, placed his hand over his heart in silent promise. As the trucks rumbled to life, the Japanese POWs climbed aboard. Some looked back over the camp, over the guard towers, the barracks, the parade ground where steam had once risen from cups of chai shared on a cold morning. Their eyes lingered not on the fences, but on the men who had guarded them, men who had not broken them, but helped mend something inside them. When the trucks finally began to roll away, several POWs lifted their hands in farewell. It was a gesture unthinkable months earlier. The sepoys raised their hands in return. The war had made them enemies. Tea had made them something else, something without a name, but real enough to leave an ache as the dust rose behind the departing convoy. The journey back to Japan was long, fragmented, and filled with silence. The Japanese POWs were moved from the Indian camp to processing centers, then to ships that carried them across seas scarred by years of conflict. Many of them had aged far beyond the calendar years they had spent in captivity. The war had etched deep lines into their faces, and the weight of survival had altered their posture, their eyes, their understanding of themselves. During the voyage home, they spoke quietly among themselves about the camp in India, the cold mornings, the slow healing of their wounds, the unexpected warmth of the sepoys who had guarded them. For many, the memories were confusing. They knew intellectually that the Indian soldiers had fought on the opposite side of the war. Yet, emotionally, the sepoys had become symbols of dignity in a world that had stripped them of it. The conflict between these truths left them both grateful and bewildered. When they finally reached Japanese soil, the homecoming was not the triumphant return they once imagined. Cities were burned, families were displaced, the nation was in ruins. Some returning soldiers found no one waiting. Others found relatives who welcomed them with relief, yet carried the silent question. Why had they surrendered and lived when so many had died with honor? That question lingered unspoken, heavy as ash. And yet, when the former POWs tried to explain their survival, they often spoke not of strategy or luck, but of the people who had shown them mercy. They described Indian guards who had offered them water during marches in the heat. They spoke of medics who dressed their wounds with gentle hands. They spoke of the shawls shared on cold nights. Above all, they spoke of that morning when tea was offered, simple, warm, undeserved, and how that moment had awakened something they had believed lost forever. Some families struggled to understand these stories. Others wept openly, moved by the idea that, even in war, strangers had lifted their sons from despair. A few veterans found themselves returning again and again to the memory of chai steam rising in the Indian winter air, a symbol of kindness that contrasted sharply with the devastation they now saw around them. In the years that followed, many of the former POWs wrote diaries, memoirs, or private notes that their descendants later discovered. In these writings, India appeared not as an enemy territory, but as a place of unexpected redemption. They described the sepoys with respect, sometimes even affection. They reflected on the cultural misunderstandings, the moments of shame, the healing that came through small daily rituals. Some wrote that they learned more about honor in captivity than they had in all their years of military training. A few were brave enough to speak publicly about their experiences, challenging the harsh stigma attached to surrender. They told audiences that kindness from an enemy was not a weakness, but a lesson. They insisted that compassion, offered freely without expectation, had saved them in ways food and shelter alone never could. In Japan's post-war years, when society struggled to rebuild not just cities but souls, these testimonies became quiet reminders that humanity had not died in the fires of conflict. They were stories passed down in families, shared in small community gatherings, sometimes whispered between generations, and always, at the heart of the memory, was that cup of tea. For the Indian soldiers, years later, the war faded into a distant chapter, replaced by new duties, new struggles, new horizons. Yet some sepoys who had served in the camp carried their own recollections of the Japanese prisoners, men who bowed deeply, who tried to learn broken Hindi, who repaired tools with perfect precision, who struggled with shame but showed gratitude without words. When they remembered the war, it was not the battles they spoke of first. It was the moment they poured tea into trembling hands on a cold morning and realized that even enemies could meet each other as human beings. Long after the repatriation, long after uniforms were folded away and rifles laid to rest, the memory remained, quiet, steady, like warmth spreading through chilled fingers. Long after the last truck rolled away from the camp, long after the war dissolved into memory and history books, the story of that simple act, tea shared between enemies, continued to ripple quietly across time. It lived not in grand monuments or official archives, but in the private corners of human hearts, in diaries written by trembling hands, in the recollections of aging soldiers who found themselves returning again and again to a single, ordinary morning that became extraordinary. For the Japanese POWs, that cup of tea had not been merely warmth against winter. It had been a moment that shattered the walls built by ideology, fear, and shame. On a battlefield, they had been told that the enemy existed without mercy. But in a small corner of India, they discovered that even in a world fractured by violence, compassion could flow across barbed wire as effortlessly as steam rising from a kettle. For the Indian sepoys, the act had been instinctive, born of a culture that believed warmth should be shared, food offered, kindness given without calculation. They had not expected to change lives. Yet, with each cup they poured, they unknowingly stitched a thread of humanity through the torn fabric of war. The world often remembers conflict through its destruction. Cities burned, lives lost, nations divided. But history also contains quieter victories, the ones that unfold in silence, a hand extended, a wound tended, a drink offered under a gray morning sky. These are the victories that do not end wars, yet reshape the meaning of them. As years passed, both sides carried the memory forward. Some Japanese veterans told their grandchildren that the first warmth they felt after surrender came not from the sun or from blankets, but from chai offered by men they once feared. Some Indian soldiers, in their final years, smiled softly as they recalled the stunned gratitude on the faces of prisoners who bowed as if the tea were sacred. In the end, the memory of that morning stands as a reminder that even in the bleakest chapters of history, humanity can surface in the simplest gestures. A cup of tea, shared in a place where hope seemed impossible, became proof that compassion endures, even when peace does not. And perhaps that is the quiet truth war can never erase. In the meeting of two hands, even for a moment, the world becomes whole again.